Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners podcast. I'm your host, Amit Somani, and I have with me a friend and a former colleague, Srinivas Narayan, who was VP engineering at Meta, formerly Facebook, where he spent the last 13, 14 years leading various engineering organizations in AI, AR, VR, and various consumer products. He is now going to be an advisor to Prime Venture Partners. Welcome to the show, Srinivas.
Thanks, Amit. I'm very excited to be here and talk with you about engineering culture.
Absolutely. Thank you for introducing the topic. And I can't think of a better person. And we've not had an engineering leader on our podcast, surprisingly, for a couple of years now. So really looking forward to explore this. Let me just go right into it, Srinivas, which is one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg is famous for talking about is move fast and break things. And I know you did a recent talk for us where you talked about the difference between audacity and fearlessness and recklessness. So can you elaborate for our listeners, many of who are early stage entrepreneurs, what does that really mean in practice?
Yeah. Facebook is famously known for this, but I think it's sometimes also misinterpreted. So let's break it into two parts. One is the move fast piece. The break things piece, I don't think we use it anymore, but I'll talk about why we used it in the early days too. The move fast is really about clearing all hurdles and really optimizing for having impact and not getting bogged down by bureaucracy or just lack of quick decision making. It's really about focus on what's the best way to have impact. And sometimes it gets interpreted as like really short-term impact, which is a little bit unfortunate. But the real principle behind moving fast is just really clear all hurdles, run as fast as you can, and don't get bogged down by bureaucracy and other things. I think it's really helped the company quite a bit. And there's always a focus on how do we have impact and what's the most useful and the biggest impactful thing we can do at any point in time. The break things piece, I think it was really meant to inspire fearlessness and not recklessness. And what I mean by that is, you want to have an engineering culture where people are encouraged to take big risk and they're not afraid to fail. And that's really what it is meant to. Otherwise you end up with cultures that I think get too conservative. They sort of in a rut, they don't really try to innovate and they don't try to really think big. But whenever you think big, there's always a huge risk of failure, right? And I think that's okay. I think you have to accept that risk. And you also have to find ways to reward people who take the risk but fail. And that's the harder part. It's easy to say that we want to encourage people to think big and be bold and be fearless. But with that comes a lot of risk. And as long as you're working on things to reward people for taking the risk, that's the sort of culture that you want, encourage people to be fearless.
Great. I have a lot of follow-on questions. One is on this notion of clear all hurdles. Now, obviously, when you have such a large company as Meta, Facebook, you have hundreds, if not thousands of engineers in various teams. So doesn't it become completely chaotic because everybody has like 5 hurdles to clear? And how do you then prioritize at a company level or perhaps even at a organization level, let's say in your AR, VR team or your AI team?
Yeah, no, I think one thing I like about Facebook, what we do well is very clear goals. So every 6 months, I would say all teams at all levels in the organization set very clear goals on what they want to accomplish. And those goals are communicated. I think they're fairly transparent. Everybody knows what your goals are. And that allows, I think, people to march in unison. So once you know what your goals are, and you know not just what your goals are, you also know what your sort of teams you collaborate with, what their goals are. And I think there is a sort of common energy that all these goals kind of ladder up towards something that even at Mark's level, that they're not 50 completely random goals, but they all add towards something bigger at a company level. And I think that structure is really important. You want to all march in unison. And once that structure is set and every 6 months, all these goals are reviewed, that allows people to sort of go together in sync. And that allows people to help each other and that allows people to look out for each other because you want to be something part of bigger than what yourself is. And I think having awareness of what the entire company is trying to do allows people to do that. And also, what's another nice thing about knowing what the highest level goals are is sometimes you realize that, holy shit, I may be marching in the wrong direction because I thought this is my goal and I'm marching here. But when you hear all the other things that are going on in the company, you might actually realize that, maybe I should adjust myself because doing X is probably better than doing Y that I was in a path. And so I think it also goes back to transparency, which is having a really open, transparent culture about what is important for the company. I think it's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, so I want to ask about, let's say, particularly in engineering context, I'm a bright engineer at Facebook or in one of the startups that has tuned in and listening in, or even an engineering manager, but not a co-founder. The engineering risk I want to take or the engineering audacity I want to show may or may not necessarily align with the business risk or the market risk or the consumer risk or whatever, right? Like how do you align that? The company is saying, look, I want to serve all customers and be bold and dominate the metaverse, but now I'm like my engineer doing something on, whatever. So how is there any thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I think my answer to this would be you have to find a way to articulate why what you're trying to do matters for the company. I think that's important at all levels in the organization. Whether you're a new engineer, whether you're an experienced engineer, a manager, you can't sort of isolate yourself and say, I want to do what I want to do. That's not helpful for anybody.
Right.
You have to find a way to say, hey, here is what I want to do, and here is why it's important for the business. And it can be an engineering goal. You may be trying to do something that enables all the other engineers around you to move faster by building better tools or better platforms or whatever. That's a great thing for the company, but you have to be able to articulate it that way. And that's, I think, really important. When everybody understands why you're doing something, I think there's also tolerance for you, that sort of like, hey, maybe yeah, we understand it's risky, but we understand the upside if it goes really well. And automatically, I think you get a little bit more leeway for failing. Whereas if you do something but you don't try to articulate why it's important, you might really create a sort of thought around, oh, this person is just doing whatever they want to do, or like they're just kind of like, you don't want that. I think you really want to try to articulate why it's important.
Wonderful. Let's talk about failure, because that is really the other side of this coin. You can be very audacious and fearless and align with the company's sort of overall mission, but yet there is this fear of survival, and you want to not be the one to rock kind of boat too much and so forth. So can you talk about a few examples at all levels of the org of how do you reward failure or encourage failure or whatever?
Sure, yeah. I think that's sort of, I'll give you maybe one early example. When this was one of my very first projects at Facebook. We were launching usernames, and it's like if you go to facebook.com/Amit, you go to your profile page. We didn't used to have that for people. So it was one of the first projects I built. It was just a couple of people. One of the funny things about that project was, we had, I think, quite a number of people. I forget, maybe 250 million users or something like that at that time. And we had no idea how many people were going to show up if we launched something. Like if you're going to say, hey, come and claim your username on Facebook, we had no idea how many people were going to come, which is, of course, we thought a lot of people would come, and the site could have crashed if too many people showed up. Like we just weren't prepared to have the extra resources to support a lot more people coming in and logging into the site. And when we were planning for how to roll this out, we were talking with Mark, and I remember telling him that, hey, there's a pretty good chance that we might bring the whole site down if we do this. And he just kind of looked at it and was like, yeah, I'm willing to take that risk. Because that was like pretty amazing to hear that, in my early days. And I don't think he was asking me to be reckless. And I think what he was saying is, hey, I think there is a certain amount of risk I'm willing to tolerate here. As long as you do the planning and the preparation and all that, I think the risk of this happening is maybe there, but he's willing to do it in what he's getting in return is a faster launch, right? Like I could have spent a lot more time being like dotting I's, crossing T's, and being everything is perfect. And it would have taken a few more months, but he's like, yeah, I don't think that risk is worth it. I would rather take the risk of something going down. But if you're going to get this in front of people a couple of months earlier, I'm willing to take that. I think that's sort of a very informed decision making, but he did that on the spot. And I think that was like, it sort of was pretty awesome to see that. And we launched it, and thankfully nothing happened, nothing bad happened. And we planned quite a bit actually, but we did it pretty fast, and it was great. That's one example. I've seen other examples, but really, for example, the team was building two different versions of how to compile PHP, and we don't know which one was going to work. And both approaches sounded reasonable. And one of them eventually we knew was not going to work, and only one of them was going to succeed. But we didn't know which one was going to work and which one was going to succeed. So we let two teams actually run in parallel, both extremely aware of what the other team was doing, because ultimately one had to succeed. And then I think after a while, people realized which track was going to go better. But the team that didn't work out was rewarded, because that risk was absolutely important for that company to take. You could have easily said, oh, your approach didn't work. and therefore you're not going to get rewarded. But we did exactly the opposite. Failure was celebrated because there was so much learning along the way, and it really paved the path for the other approach to succeed. So I think you have to do this in a thoughtful way where there is good reason for taking the risk. The other thing I would say is communication is extremely important for these types of projects, right? You want to separate out failure due to being bold and taking something that's inherently risky versus a failure due to just pure execution. You don't want poor execution, and I don't think you want to tolerate that. And I think, but inherently risky things need to be tolerated. And for that, you need really, really good communication. You need people who communicate why you're doing it, what is the risk, what are the milestones, am I going on the right path, should I pivot, should I stop the project, and constant communication. What lessons did I learn? Now, all these things are really important. And I think I would put a lot more emphasis on great communication for those projects.
Yeah, I think you emphasized this, and we'll come back to this when we talk a little bit about hiring. But what this tells me, and I think you've shared this earlier as well, that engineers have a lot more degrees of freedom and a lot more freedom in general, and in a culture like that. But obviously, that has to be balanced with some accountability and responsibility. So, can you talk about some of those, at least non-conventional things, or how do you balance those two?
Yeah. No, I think this is one of the things I love about Facebook culture. And I think it was fantastic to see it in the early days when I was there. And surprisingly, it has held to a very large extent, even as the company scaled over the years, which is, eventually the company is not, I would say, very process driven, right? What engineers and people in general have enormous amount of freedom to accomplish their goals. What people are held accountable to is, like I said, every 6 months people plan and you communicate what your goals are. Once you communicate what your goals are, you have a lot of freedom on how you want to achieve them, on how you want to achieve your goals. Nobody's going to come and tell you what to do or how to achieve them as long as you achieve them. So that gives you an enormous amount of freedom to achieve what you want to do what you want. But with that comes the responsibility and the accountability that, hey, I'm committing to these goals, right? And of course, if things change, things learn, you can of course change things, but there is a certain amount of commitment and accountability that comes with the goals, but a lot of freedom in how you accomplish that. And I think that creates a certain bottom-up culture and a lot of ownership over things. And people feel incredibly excited because they have more ownership over their ideas. They have the freedom to change things. There's nobody telling them what to do. In fact, they are telling, here's sort of the high-level framework, and here is what I'm going to achieve and how I'm going to do it. So I think that creates a fantastic culture. And often I think decision-making happens at the right level. So in many other organizations, I think sort of like one principle for me is like also make sure that you're pushing decision making at the right level. The people who have the most knowledge about certain things should be the ones who are empowered to make the decisions about them.
So the question that is sort of coming into my mind is a lot of the classic sort of engineering organizations, dare I say, or in classic companies, you also want predictability and reliability and repeatability. So I'm just trying to figure out beyond the 6-month goal alignment, how do you get that on a regular basis, right? Because you're checking in code, things are going live, there's 100 experiments or 1,000 experiments running every day. So how does this not like kind of, borderline into, again, chaos?
Maybe there's a few different things maybe you're asking, right? One is predictability. I mean, the predictability, I'm not sure that's that useful. Like, predictability in what, right? If you're going to commit to your goals and, you can set goals at whatever granularity you want, you can set it quarterly, you can set it at a half year. If you're able to achieve this, and as long as they are big, they're bold, they're audacious, and if you kind of look back 3 months and say, hey, yeah, we achieved this and we feel really good about it, it doesn't matter whether you got done in 1 week or a half a week or this or that. I think instead of having predictability at day-to-day basis, I think what you're getting is sort of audacious goals at maybe a quarterly level or at a half level. So I value that a lot more than the day-to-day predictability of is this specific thing, this task getting done in 1 week versus that. Like, I think what I find is that sort of thinking about it in a higher level sort of elevates the entire organization, right? You're not getting stuck in with the mundane details of this small thing getting done and is that person check-in and all that. Like you empower all the people in your team to know how to do it, and you don't worry about it, and you elevate your thinking and sort of like, are we accomplishing something higher than all of that at a higher level?
If I may interrupt, right? Because you do see there is engineering, but you're also collaborating with other teams, like could be legal, could be PR, could be product management, could be marketing. So they're also dependent on you. They're not writing code. They're not shipping code. Now, of course, we could say, hey, look, we'll launch usernames in July of 2022, and that's all there is to it, right?
Yeah.
But you're sort of building up to that. So that's kind of maybe talk a little bit about sort of cross-org collaboration in this context.
Yeah. So when I talk about goal setting, it's actually important to realize that those are not just engineering goals, right? Like those are goals for the entire team. And those are very cross-functional teams. They have product managers, designers, user researchers, analytics, like all other functions. And so that's the team that is collectively committing towards those goals. And all functions are actually coming together to accomplish them. It's not just one function saying, this is the goal and all of that. And that's what allows everybody to move together.
Great. Maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the tools. And I know you said not a very process-oriented company, but like best principles beyond goal setting, like next level down, that help, right? Either at an engineering level or OKRs or whatever, right? Saying these are specific tools that you would love to have, if you went to a different company or started a new one, right? Saying these things I definitely want to have with me.
Like I said, I think the process and tools are sort of like, I wouldn't say that that's standardized. The process is sort of up to each person. The things that I think help us quite a bit is continuous pushes, right? Code is done releasing to production all the time. I think that's an absolutely amazing thing to have. So which is the train is leaving all the time and you just figure out which train you want to get on. And so that enables the move fast culture quite a bit, which is you commit something into your code base, it's going live. And of course, you can put gatekeepers and things that make sure that if it's not ready for public consumption, you can prevent all that. But the code is still checked in and it's going live. And I think that's an amazing culture that I would encourage people to have, which is just constant velocity of shipping things all the time. Other thing, I think it's a subtle one, but what enables this is, break your work into small chunks, small shippable chunks. Don't take, if like there's a feature that's going to take, and it doesn't mean every feature is going to take only one day to finish, right? Some things are going to take years or some things are going to take maybe months to do. Break it into meaningful chunks so that you're always sort of building something towards and incrementally building up to something. That allows the constant velocity and you're always committing something. And I think that's a very, very helpful and healthy thing to do. So that's on the quality side. I mean, good diff review culture. I think people always look for code reviews and really constructive feedback. And I think that's a great part of the culture. I think that sort of helps set the quality bar. What else would I do? I mean, like I said, it's not process driven, but people sometimes have monthly goals. Sometimes people have weekly goals. They have ad hoc scrums, etc. So those are all sort of like just up to each team and figure out whatever works for them.
How about tools, right? I know you have mentioned somewhere else. I saw that there's a big culture of inventing tools or writing things up. But again, trying to translate it to younger startups, they may not have that luxury. So any either tools that you would recommend or any kind of guiding principles on how they should think about inventing their own tools, so to speak.
I think the classic engineering tools, I don't think I need to specify things. I think people have talked about it publicly, from code reviews to task management, whatever it is. I don't think there's any magic there. So I think I'd encourage people to do that. The thing that culturally that I think is really helpful for us has been one that always looks at how can we improve our engineering velocity, right? What is causing people to move slowly? And you want to always be thinking about, there's always something that could go faster. There is something that people are doing in a manual way that can be improved. And I think that culture about constantly thinking about how can I improve the velocity overall for engineers and building systems or tools to help them in those, I think have been incredibly helpful. So always look at what's slowing you down and what can I do to invest in improving the overall productivity of people. I think that mindset is really important, more than anything else. And I think that each company is different. And I think that's one thing about engineering culture, right? Which is, it's the quote from Peter Thiel that comes to my mind, right? Like all happy companies are different and, all failed companies are the same. So all happy companies are different. And I think the set of tools that one company needs is going to be different from what somebody else needs. But this approach towards always thinking about how can I improve productivity, I think that's the mindset I'd encourage everybody to have.
I think that's lovely because I think that just breaks through all the clutter in terms of prioritization, trade-offs, etc. Right? It's just like you're optimizing for velocity and speed of shipping things. That's it. So it just becomes simpler. That leads me to my next question, that you have a strong mindset in engineering of kind of quote unquote always be improving, right? Kaizen. Can you talk a little bit about that at, again, an org level, individual level?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a culture of being self-critical and always improving. I think really important in both as an individual and I think also as an organization. I think what personally for me also, that's one of the things I've learned, which is you have to be your toughest critic. If other people are starting to like point out things in you, it's sort of like that's a good learning experience for you. If you're critical about yourself, you're automatically sort of setting a bar that's high enough. And I think it enables the entire organization to have a really, really high bar. So I think this approach of thought of being self-critical, always being improving, enables everybody to think that, hey, things will always can be better. No matter how well you're doing, things can always be better, right? And I think that allows what it accomplishes, I think, is that it just raises the ambition for everybody. Even if you think you're doing well, if you feel like you're doing better, you're constantly upping your game, right? And I think that constant improvement process and improvement cycle has been it's been really critical for the culture. And I think, like I said, it pervades everything that we do. We talked about investing in tools to make engineering productivity better. That also comes from the same mindset that things can always be better. Even another thing, like I said, one in goal setting, right? Like people are encouraged to have goals that they meet only half the time or 50% of the goals. That's like the classic saying in Facebook, which is that you set goals so that you meet 50% of them. And that sounds like odd in the first, like, why would I have goals that I only hit half of them, right? But the intent there is that you're encouraging people to be bold enough that if you're hitting all your goals, you're not being ambitious enough, right? You have to sort of fail a little bit to make sure that you actually set ambitious goals. And again, if you're hitting all the goals, then there's always like people look at you and say, maybe you should be more ambitious next time. So this constant, things should be better, this mindset is really important. And I think that leads down into another one, which is also being bold. And we talked about being bold and fearless, but there's also boldness in the ambition of what you want to accomplish, right? I think one of the things that stood out for me is when I joined, Facebook had probably like more than 100 million users or something like that. But right from day one, there was always this like, we want to have everybody in the world be on Facebook. That was the ambition, right? And that was clear. And for an early person who joined the company, who was a little bit cynical, I was a little bit cynical. It's like, yeah, right? But guess what? Like we have 3 billion people now. And it's amazing to see what that level of ambition does to you. And even in terms of revenue, when I joined, we weren't making much money. And I think, but people, maybe we were valued, the revenues were small, but we were valued at probably $4 or $5 million or something like that. But people said, hey, we're going to be a $1 trillion company one day. And again, in the early days, when you first joined, it's like, you were kind of cynical, but look at what has happened in 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. One of the things we advise and we work very closely with our startups at Prime is imagine yourself at a 50x or 100x scale of where you are today. Just imagine it for a day or two, and then work backwards towards product, engineering, culture, process, whatever, right? Yeah. Principles. And almost everybody who starts with like, no, I just need to get to X number of users or Y $1 million of revenue. And they say, oh, if I'm at 100 million ARR, none of this shit is going to work. And so what does that mean? Obviously, you're not sort of prematurely scaling things up, but it just makes you think very differently. So I think that is wonderful. So, give me some examples, Srinivas, of where you had your most growth just for this principle of being self-critical or Kaizen or be-learning. Just maybe one example, and then we can move on from this topic.
Yeah, I think probably one where I've personally grown quite a bit is actually when things weren't going well. And in hindsight, I've done a lot of things, but there were moments during my career when I thought I was failing. And I was like, we had goals and we weren't hitting the goals. And it was a really hard problem that we were trying to solve and it just wasn't working. And I think what I learned is that one, I sort of didn't acknowledge the problem early enough. I sort of pretended like the problem was going to go away, that it was just going to, we work hard and it will just kind of happen. And I sort of didn't acknowledge the seriousness of the problem early enough. And what happened as a result is that I didn't get help fast enough. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned over time is that sometimes the set of problems you're solving, you cannot solve on your own. And they're way bigger than yourself. And in any company, that's probably true. If you're working on hard enough problems, big enough problems, they're going to be bigger than yourself. And don't try to be a hero. Don't try to say, okay, I'm going to solve this problem. You got to ask for all the help that you need, right? And that's what is important. And I think that was one, I think my lessons, like I said earlier, were one, I wasn't critical enough of myself. I thought it wasn't a big enough problem. I didn't acknowledge it. Two, I didn't ask for help early enough. I thought I'll sort of like find a way to solve it myself because I wasn't used to failure. And I think this happens for a lot of people. For a lot of people who become successful, the first time you run into failure, it's like you kind of it's hard to it's hard to acknowledge it. And I think really sort of like stepping back and say, shit, I need a lot of help. And I think that's really important.
Great. So as we get towards the end of the podcast here, I love this quote that you had shared earlier, which is that hiring is an engineering problem, not a recruiting problem.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a bit on that? And in general, how do you hire? Because for all these things you said, freedom, responsibility, accountability, audaciousness, hiring is the core jet fuel that is going to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think every startup is and every company is going to go through this, right? Which is how do you get the talent you need to really build the things that you want? And what I mean by hiring is an engineering problem, not a recruiting problem, is that you can't just throw hiring to a recruiting team and say, go solve this for me. You have to look at it as an engineering problem, and you have to completely partner with your recruiting team and HR team and all that. And what I mean by an engineering problem is that really look at it as a sort of an engineering product. You're trying to hire somebody, and people who these days are very familiar with growth funnels. Like, if you're trying to acquire customers, you probably are building growth funnels. You're probably trying to analyze the growth funnel. You're trying to analyze what step in the growth funnel is working, what's not working. Look at the hiring also as a growth problem. You're just not building customers. You're bringing engineers into your engineers or any other function into your company, and that's also a process. That's also a funnel. Are you getting enough people at the top of the funnel? If not, you need to work on your branding. You need to work on your engineering presence. Are you getting people in, but are they not failing? Like, then you're not maybe attracting the right people. So really looking at it as an engineering problem, as a funnel, and where in the funnel are you failing, and finding ways to optimize that. I think it's a really important thing to do. And Facebook has been doing that. I'm sure some companies also do that. But I think for startups, just really the rigor in thinking about this as an engineering problem, I think is very helpful.
Talk about the interview process itself, right? Were there nuances? Because you obviously worked at multiple startups, multiple companies, larger, smaller ones.
No, one thing I think that we put a lot of energy into is the actual interview process, and the interview questions and the interviewers, perhaps most importantly, which is that there is a whole amount of training that happens to people before they can interview anybody else. And this is really important because interviewing is a skill, just like anything else, right? And it's a skill that can be improved. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody, and it's not something that is taught. And so you have to again look at it as a skill to build on, skill to learn, skill to improve on. And that's the way we do it. We train people. And then once we train people, the first time they interview, we actually do what's called shadowing, reverse shadowing. So somebody observes how you interview, somebody who's been more experienced, and they give you feedback and say, hey, this part could have been better. And that's super helpful for people. The last thing we do is centralized decision making for recruiting. Like all engineering recruiting decisions go through a central committee, and the committee reviews all the packets. And I think this happens at Google also, and probably other companies too. And that committee looks at the interview packets, they read the interview feedback, and they also give feedback to the interviewers and then say, hey, there isn't enough here for me to help make a decision. So maybe you need to focus on how do you write better feedback so that we know which packet we are looking at. So I think it's just really helpful, that rigor in thinking about interview processes, and rigor in writing feedback, writing high quality feedback. I think it's very helpful.
Wonderful. And the last thing that I would say there is, how do you get people oriented to the quote unquote Facebook way in terms of post the interviewing, right? Post the offer committee, everything is done. Any kind of tips and best practices, particularly from an engineering or a new hire point of view?
Yeah, Facebook did this, still does this, called Bootcamp. It's very famous. And Boss, who's the CTO now, he started it. And I was one of the first few batches of it who went through it. So it's basically a 4 to 6 week program aimed at assimilating and onboarding new people who join the company. And the goal really is to give people a broad exposure to what this company is about, engineering, not just engineering, actually. Everybody goes through it, all people, but in engineering, it's 4 to 6 weeks. You get a broad overview of all the different systems, the company culture, the products that we build. One, it helps you understand how things work at this place, what's important, what gets valued, how to be impactful. It helps you build relationships with other people. It also helps you build a holistic sense for what the mission for the company is and what products are. Because it's in large organizations, especially, it's very easy to get siloed into your own world and you lose the big picture. Like you go and work on something, and that's important, but you sort of don't know how all that fits into something bigger. And I think that going through this onboarding process also really helps understand how what you're doing fits into the larger picture. And I think that's always helpful because when you have a bigger picture, it helps you do things that are more useful and more impactful for the company. So it's a 4 to 6 week process. It's also aimed at being very hands-on. And actually, one of the things that I did in the first day, I shipped code into production, right? The very first day. And so that also instills in you a sense of what move fast really means. And these days I'm not sure it's one day anymore, but that sense of, hey, you're here to actually have impact, and impact means doing something and getting it in front of people, that gets reinforced. And maybe it's a week now, it's instead of a few days or a day, but that again is important. You want to reinforce the things, that the cultural elements about your company that you want all new people to carry forward with it.
Great. So Srinivas, as we wrap up here, any one sort of big takeaway from your point of view for people? I mean, there are lots of interesting insights.
I mean, there's lots that I think we talked about, which is about right from moving fast to having a big, bold vision, freedom and responsibility, being self-critical, having a strong desire to win. And maybe one more thing I'd leave people with, which is one of my favorite things also, is focus. I think especially for startups, I think there's only one thing that you need to do. And you always have to think about what is that one thing you can do better than anybody else. It's easy to get distracted at any stage in a company trying to do too many things, but I would leave with that thought. And Facebook is also, I think one of the better companies at doing this at scale. Even though we're a large company, there's always a unifying mission towards everything that the company does. And that creates focus for everybody. So I would leave people with that thought, which is always think about what is the one thing you can do better than anybody else, who everybody in the world is going to remember you for.
Thank you so much, Srinivas. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Amit. It was great being here.
Listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.